Tū tawa mai e runga, tū tawa mai e raro, tū tawa mai e roto, tū tawa mai e waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tai. Kia ora and welcome to this educational session on historical materialism and our socialist tradition, presented by Romany and Brad. They'll have each about 10 to 12 minutes to talk. And without further ado, let's get into it. Romany.
Yes, a lot to fit in. So we wanted to have at least one session in this hui for sort of Marxist fundamentals, and we've decided to cover a lot in a short amount of time. As always, to try to make things accessible for people who are new to the group and who are still wanting to become familiar with these concepts, and also to hopefully sort of like ground us as well for our discussions. So Brad is going to talk a bit about what we call, we often call a political tradition, but we don't want to treat Marxism as a dogma, so as this fixed set of edicts that are sort of handed down from on high. So it's more useful to look at Marxism as a mode of analysis, as a framework that anyone can kind of pick up and use to understand the world. And a term we often use for this mode of analysis is historical materialism. So as the name suggests, this is a materialist framework. So it starts with the assumption that we live in a material world. Don't worry, the rest of my quotes are from the Communist Manifesto. Don't worry. That we live in a material world and that we are part of that material world, including human societies, as posited by Madonna. So this material world is not fixed and unchanging. So the historical part of historical materialism deals with the question of how things change. So it deals with the complex interactions between humans and the wider environment. It deals with human societies and the way that people are both shaped by the societies that they're in and have the capacity to shape those societies. So these relationships can be described as dialectical, and historical materialism is sometimes described as dialectical materialism. So some characteristics of the dialectical mode of analysis, and obviously I'm going to struggle to cover this whole concept, but we often describe it in terms of totality. So seeing individual parts as inextricable from the whole, seeing things in a constant state of change, and avoiding sort of reductive cause and effect narratives, instead seeing phenomena as being in a complex interrelationship with each other. So when it comes to historical materialism and the way that people shape the world, we are less interested in the deeds of exceptional individuals, although obviously that can play a really important role, and are more interested in the mass of people in history from below and in the relationship between different classes of people. So I've drawn on a short introduction from John Molyneux for some of this intro. So according to Molyneux, Karl Marx developed the core of this theory within a year, 1844 to 1845, when Marx himself was quite young when he began sort of thinking through these ideas. So between 26 and 27. And by this time, Marx was already sort of politically and intellectually committed to the revolutionary potential of the working class, and that is sort of inextricable from his writing on historical materialism. So in describing the world, Marx starts with material conditions, and in particular with production and reproduction. So how people acquire or create the things that we need to live. One way to talk about production is to name different modes of production. So capitalism is a mode of production where human life is organized around the production of commodities and the accumulation of capital. Analyzing production, Marx posited a dialectical relationship between the forces of production and the relations of production. So the forces of production, as in the resources, tools, labor, and knowledge, and the things that enable us to produce. The relations of production, the social relations that humans enter into in the process of production. So in the case of capitalism, the relationship between capital and labor. There is a dialectical relationship between the forces of production and the relations of production. So on the one hand, the forces of production shape the relations of production. At the same time, those social relationships, facilitate the development of the forces of production. So consider the rapid technological changes that have developed with capitalism and the way that this has been shaped by class relations and has shaped class relations in its turn. Social classes also have a dialectical relationship to each other. So they mutually constitute each other. You can't be a capitalist if you don't have anyone to labor for you. You can't be a wage worker if there are no capitalists to work for. So something which characterizes a dialectical relationship in Marxist terms is the possibility of revolutionary change. So a dialectical relationship doesn't imply an equilibrium that sustains itself over time. Instead, these relationships have a tendency to generate new possibilities that push beyond existing relations. So in Marx's terms, he posited that over time, the relations of production can become a fetter and a block on the forces of production. And the result is contradiction, crisis, and the possibility of revolutionary upheaval. So to take the example of feudalism, as many Marxists do, to sort of explain these things, Marxists posited that there were developments within feudalism that made capitalism possible. So a rising class of, and I don't expect you to read this whole quote because it's quite long, but these are sort of some of the factors that Marx is pointing to in the Communist Manifesto as contributing to these developments. So a rising class of bourgeoisie pushed to extend these developments, while the feudal aristocracy resisted this as a challenge to their power. The tensions created by this are responsible for the bourgeois revolutions that ensued in England, France, America, Haiti, and so on. Today, capitalism itself generates immense possibilities. So we have productive capacity to feed the world many times over. Technology is developed, which could radically change human society, perhaps for the better. But all of this is subordinated to the relations of production, in which everything must be geared towards profit. Capitalism also generates contradiction. So the competition that's at the heart of capitalist relations creates a chaotic system that is plagued by economic crises. And Marxists argue, well as political crises, as we've been discussing. Marxists argue that these are intractable and they're resolvable only with a complete change in the relations of production. And crucially, Marxists argue that the possibility for such a change in social relations exists. So capitalism creates, for example, sites of production and workplaces that are essentially cooperative. It creates a class of people, the working class, who have the means to organize society collectively and the interests to do so. After all, the current system is not serving our interests. Thank you. Some cautions against reductionism, and maybe I can sort of touch on this quite briefly and we can pick up in a bit on it more in the discussion. But there are potential pitfalls here from a sort of a shallow engagement with this. So the language of modes of production has led some Marxists to conceive of history as this universal linear progress from one mode of production to another, up through, capitalism and then inevitably socialism. And this is something which people both within and outside of the Marxist tradition have pushed back on. For example, Trotsky with the concept of the permanent revolution. And another pitfall being economic determinism. So, even if we could separate off economics from the rest of the facets of society, this is only one thing that is shaping historical change and is also shaped by the other factors. So what's the place of ideas within a materialist framework? So to begin with, we try to avoid thinking about ideas as if they have some kind of separate autonomous existence outside of human beings and outside of human society. Ideas are shaped by our environment. They can be limited by our environment. So it can be difficult to imagine something that's radically different from your day-to-day life. And even when you can think of something that's outside the box, it's very hard to give this life outside of yourself. It's hard for ideas to flourish in environments that are not hospitable to them. Those who have the greater ability to shape the external world have a greater ability to shape the ideas that predominate, hence this popular takatoki from Marx. So obviously another caution here, we should not think of humans as just sort of automata, as robots acting out predetermined economic destinies. So there are kind of three things to keep in mind here. One is just because human thought and behavior and politics is shaped by our environment doesn't mean that it's predictable or easily reducible to a formula. Two, as always, we are not describing one-way relationships here. So humans have the ability to consciously reflect on and shape our wider environment. And finally, we need to keep in mind revolutionary potential. So material reality itself is contradictory, and every society contains the seeds of other potential societies. Capitalism structures our lives in such a way that it naturalizes competition and individualism, for example, in some ways. In other ways, it structures our lives in a way that necessitates cooperation and that necessitates resistance as we come up against the failures and the injustices of the capitalist system. And while, in ordinary times, the capitalist class obviously has immense ability to shape the material world and therefore to shape the ideas that predominate, the masses also have a huge ability to shape reality around us in a practical way. So every time that we do so and that we practically interrupt the workings of the capitalist system, we are opening up spaces for other ideas to become possible. Yeah, I think that's it from me. We can touch more on this in discussion, and I'll just hand it over to Brad.
Thanks so much, Romany. I think that all leads in really well to the next part of this talk, which is a very brief history condensed into 10 minutes of the IS, International Socialist tradition. This was originally a 25-minute talk. This is 10 minutes, so we'll be skipping over a bunch of stuff. And secondly, I'm only going to be talking about 3 texts to give us some core ideas to work with. I'm not going to go into the histories of different party formations and splits and so on, except for the initial one. So if you do want to update us with some history, you can do that in the discussion. I welcome that. So I'll be talking about Tony Cliff's State Capitalism in Russia, Al Draper's Two Souls of Socialism, and Chris Harman's Party and Class. So firstly, state capitalism in Russia came out in the 1950s. The mainstream Trotskyist organizations like the Revolutionary Communist Party held the line, as you will have heard, I'm sure, that the Soviet Union was a degenerated workers' state, a sort of transition between socialism and capitalism. And by the time of the mid-20th century, this was becoming less and less convincing to people like Tony Cliff and others. And it resulted in this book where he laid out some of the fundamental arguments that underpin our tradition. So I'll just go through a few of them really quickly. So why is Russia not a workers' state in this period? Firstly, workers' committees were stripped of their authority. So one textbook in Soviet economic law in 1935 went so far as to state that, quote, one-man management is the most important principle of the organization of socialist economy. Which is pretty bang on, I'm sure. Secondly, collective agreements ceased in 1934. I double-checked this with some other sources. We have collective agreements in our country. We have an openly capitalist country, and in Russia, that was subordinated to economic development, which is supposed to come first. Relatedly, strikes were outlawed and punishable by death. So according to one law that came in 1927, if you were caught striking, you could be stripped of your property, be thrown in jail for a year, and in more serious cases, shot to death. So those are the consequences of what we consider, a fundamental tool in our arsenal. Fourthly, this can only happen because the overwhelming majority of the means of production in Russia was in the hands of the state. So they had the leverage to be able to impose these laws over the workers. And lastly, competition on the world market led to a focus on accumulation. So throughout the 1930s, Stalin would give these speeches demanding huge increases in things like pig iron, machinery, vehicles, to keep pace with other countries. And I think that's a key distinction as well, that state capitalism is different from capitalism elsewhere, in that the state takes a central role in organizing the means of production and effectively acts as a big enterprise in competition with others on the world market, as opposed to having internal competition within its own borders. And so the consequences of this, so this wasn't purely a historical argument, but a political one. It meant, of course, that if this was true, that Russia was capitalist, it means there was nothing to defend, that we could sort of be released from the kind of the shackles of having to justify its crimes, and I think rightfully turn against it. So moving on to number two, the two souls of socialism. So this was originally written in a student magazine in 1960, later developed in 1966. So this comes from the American side of our tradition, which divides this history of socialism into two categories, socialism from above and socialism from below. So socialism from above collects all of those tendencies which want to hand down socialism to the grateful masses, and by a ruling elite that sort of acts in their name and sort of substitutes themselves for the working class. And so this is something that unites both Stalinist parties and social democratic ones. That is opposed to socialism from below, which is the view that socialism can only be realized by the self-emancipation of the workers themselves, taking their place in history. And this was essentially the key intervention from Marx and Engels, who obviously weren't the first or only socialists, but were the ones that had this key idea to essentially combine socialism and democracy, a material reorganization of society based on the active participation of ordinary people. And I think that's a really key development. And this, as we noted before, is a really useful idea in navigating crises in global politics. And that our principle is that we support the aspirations of ordinary people over states as our starting point, and then we go from there. Thirdly, Party and Class by Chris Harman. I'm going to skip the first half of this. I don't have time, but I want to sort of isolate the central point, which is on democratic centralism. So quickly to explain what that is for those who are unfamiliar, easily summed up by this line, democracy in discussion, centralism in action. So a few main points here. Firstly, this is what we're doing today, right? So we are all here together, able to participate and have exhaustive discussion over the way we want to lead the organization over the next year. We want our members then to be active, and everybody is responsible for carrying out those tasks, and everybody is held to those decisions that we made, say, in this room today, and is responsible to each other. And so Harman's insight here, I think, is that democracy and centralism are not opposed, but are really mutually reinforcing. They're in a dialectical relationship. Unless the party has clear boundaries and unless it is cohesive enough to actually implement its decisions, then the decisions that are made democratically are effectively useless, right? Or could be really diminished. So one example that was raised in our branch, if I'm in a union and we vote to go on strike, we expect everybody to go on strike and not cross the picket line, whether or not they voted for that. And we have a similar thing in our organization. If we decide on a line, we carry it out. The other point is that political clarity and understanding is really, really important. The line that he uses here, I think, could use some updating, which is to raise the political development of the newest members to the level of the oldest members. I think sometimes that can be not so true. Sometimes the older members can become a little bit pessimistic or lose their way, and sometimes the younger members are really, really key to sort of bringing in some sort of vitality. But I think the point still stands that we want people to be acting based on informed decisions rather than loyalty or simply deference to leadership. Because if you don't understand the tasks that you're doing, it's really easy to be led astray by people who may use some fancy language. And so one line that I think is really useful that Cliff uses in his biography of Lenin, if members are well integrated, discipline follows 99% from conviction and only 1% from mechanical obedience. And I think that's something that's really relevant today as well, as we have an upsurge in interest in left-wing organizing, and we might want to be opening our gates a little bit. That would entail, I think, a requisite sort of balancing in education for those members coming through. And so in turn, centralism, the unity in action part, is strengthened by open discussion debate. So if everybody is able to take part in the debate, to participate in it, to understand it, the stronger those decisions will ultimately be when they are carried out.